Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're here again to plunge into some really groundbreaking ideas, try and distill them, into insights that genuinely shift how you see things. Today, we're tackling a theory that, well, it doesn't just tweak our understanding of language or mathematics or even AI. It feels like it completely reimagines it. For centuries, really, our whole pursuit of knowledge, especially in logic and math, it's always been about this relentless quest for clarity, right? Precision, certainty. It's always been about stripping away the ambiguity, filtering out what we often call the noise, just to find that one single objective truth. But what if that very noise, the subjectivity, the inherent undefinability, even the paradoxes we find in human language, what if those aren't actually flaws we need to get rid of? What if they're essential, like creative forces in their own right? That's really the core question driving this deep dive today. We're exploring GTME, that's geometry, topology, mathematics, indefiniteness. Bit of a mouthful. It's a theory that just completely flips the script. It suggests that subjectivity isn't some kind of bug in how we communicate. It's actually a fundamental feature, absolutely essential for, well, the incredible richness and creativity we see in human language. So our mission today is to really get our heads around how GTMA doesn't just, acknowledge this idea. It actually builds a formal mathematical apparatus to analyze and describe subjectivity. It's not trying to purge it. It embraces it. Think about that for a second. GTME uses geometry to define the shapes and dimensions of meaning. It uses topology to map the relationships, the structures within those meanings, and then rigorous mathematics to formalize it all. It's a genuinely bold new way to look at how we understand each other.
Yeah, what's truly fascinating here is precisely that. GTMA represents a profoundly novel theoretical framework. It's not just an add-on. It's specifically designed right from the ground up to mathematically model that inherent subjectivity that just, well, saturates language. Most of us are probably familiar with traditional computational linguistics, right? Which for a long time has viewed ambiguity and subjectivity as basically noise, something to be filtered out, minimized, for the sake of clarity or maybe computational efficiency. GTMA, on the other hand, takes a diametrically opposed stance. It posits that these qualities, subjectivity, ambiguity, they aren't just present. They are fundamental. They're intrinsically creative and crucially essential properties of how we actually communicate.
So it's a complete shift in perspective then.
Absolutely. It leads to a profound paradigm shift in how we even approach meaning itself. So instead of relentlessly chasing after a single objective meaning for every word or concept, GTME proposes a way to formally map the dynamic, multi-layered space of all possible interpretations. Think about the traditional question, maybe something like, how can we objectively measure the meaning of, say, justice? That's a question completely rooted in that search for a definitive singular truth. But within the GTME framework, the question transforms. It becomes more like, how can we formally describe the space of all possible interpretations of justice, as it's understood by different observers, perhaps in different contexts, maybe even changing over time?
Right, so it brings the observer right into the equation. Not as noise, but as part of the system creating meaning.
Precisely. This isn't just some linguistic nuance. It's a foundational reevaluation of how meaning itself is constructed. It explicitly brings the observer into the system, meaning in GTM, it just doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's always the result of the interaction between, say, the linguistic sign, the word, and the observer. Think about it. A doctor and a poet might both analyze the phrase broken heart. They'll each arrive at different interpretations, right? But both are equally valid within the GTMA framework precisely because their observational lenses, their contexts are different. And as the theory explicitly states, GTM is quite literally the mathematics of linguistic subjectivity. It embraces and formalizes the very thing that other models try desperately to escape.
Okay, this is where it gets really compelling for me. Because GTMA's core thesis, it isn't just tweaking an old idea. It feels like a foundational rewrite of how we understand language itself. It basically says that undefinability and subjectivity, they're not errors in language. They're not mistakes. They are, in fact, key, indispensable aspects that actually allow for creativity, for adaptation, for the constant emergence of new meanings. I mean, think about how language evolves, right? How slang pops up, how poetry works. It thrives on this fluidity, this open-endedness. Traditional mathematical approaches to language, like we just touched upon, they're constantly striving to find an objective truth, to pin down precise definitions. And anything that deviates from that, it's often just dismissed as error or noise. GTMA completely reverses this perspective. It suggests the noise is actually the signal. It's the very source of language's dynamic power.
And to truly appreciate this reversal, we really need to dive into what indefiniteness actually means in this context. It's a key term. So indefiniteness, it refers to a characteristic or maybe a state where something lacks an unambiguous ultimate definition. It doesn't have clear boundaries or an established fixed status. It can manifest in different ways, maybe as indeterminacy, perhaps fluidity, or simply openness. It depends on whether we're talking philosophically, mathematically, linguistically, or even about, well, the nature of existence. The fundamental question that GTM tackles head-on is this: can something be observed while simultaneously not being defined? And that really challenges a deep-seated assumption many of us hold.
Can you observe something without defining it first?
Exactly. Let's explore this across a few different fields, because it pops up everywhere once you start looking. So in the realm of philosophy and phenomenology, you have thinkers like Husserl or Merleau-Ponty. They argue that experience always precedes definition. Always. You can observe, or maybe just experience, a phenomenon long before you have the words or the theories to fully conceptualize it. Imagine, say, encountering a completely new natural phenomenon. You see it, you perceive its effects, but you don't yet have the language or a scientific framework to fully describe it, to categorize it. The definition in this view, it's a secondary construct. It's an attempt to capture and classify what has already been observed. It's like a mapping. It's not the territory itself.
Wow. So even at that fundamental level, how we perceive the world, things aren't always defined until after we observe them. That's a profound thought for language, isn't it?
It really is. And quantum physics provides a fascinating scientific parallel. The state of a particle, say an electron, can exist in a superposition. That means it's underdetermined until the very moment of measurement. The actual act of observation changes its state. So you observe an effect, maybe a click on a detector, but before that measurement, the reality at the quantum level isn't unambiguous. It isn't fixed. This actually formalizes the idea of observability without a definitive pre-state. The particle is observed, sure, but its precise properties aren't fixed until that observation actually occurs.
Okay, so it's not just philosophy, it's built into physics too.
Right. And even in the supposedly precise domains of mathematics and logic, we find entities that are formally undefinable, even if we can discuss their properties or their existence. A classic example is Russell's paradox, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. We can describe it, we understand its implications for set theory, but it resists the definitive non-paradoxical definition within certain formal systems. It points to the inherent limits of what we can neatly categorize.
Even math has its fuzzy edges.
Exactly. And in language and concepts, this is maybe most obvious in our everyday lives. Just think about inherently indeterminate concepts, things like life or art or consciousness.
Right.
We observe instances of them, right? We discuss them endlessly. We can point to examples. But do we have one definitive, universally agreed upon boundary or definition for any of them? Not really. Their meaning is fluid, it's contextual, it often resists strict categorization, yet we use these words constantly. They work.
Yeah, we talk about art all the time without a single definition everyone agrees on.
Precisely. And in psychology and consciousness, this resonates deeply too. You can experience a complex emotion or a psychological state, say grief or maybe intense joy, before you can even name it, before you have the precise words to articulate it. The feeling exists, it's observed internally, maybe physically even, but the verbalization, the definition, often comes later, if at all. Self-awareness, in many ways, precedes its linguistic articulation. We feel before we label.
Okay, so the answer to that fundamental question is yes.
A resounding yes. Something absolutely can be observed while simultaneously not being defined. Observation, whether it's sensory, cognitive, or phenomenological, it doesn't require a prior fixed definition of the object being observed. Definitions, rather, are secondary constructs. They are tools the mind creates to categorize, maybe to tame, what has already been noticed, experienced, or known. And this really lays the groundwork for GTM's approach. It takes this fundamental insight and builds a whole mathematical theory around it.
That's a really powerful point, and maybe deeply counterintuitive for some.
Yeah.
Which leads us to an equally fascinating question, I think. How can you even begin to create a theory of something as slippery, as seemingly nebulous as undefinability? I mean, this isn't like theorizing about gravity or,
Right.
electromagnetism, where you have clear, measurable phenomena you're trying to define. This is about embracing the lack of definition. For some people, the idea of undefinability as a core concept might feel a bit, well, unscientific, maybe too vague for a formal theory. How would GTM respond to that kind of skepticism? What's its justification for trying something so audacious?
That's a perfectly valid question, and it gets to the heart of why GTM feels so radical.
Right. And to understand how GTM might justify this, we can actually look to Imre Lakatos' theory of scientific research programs. It's a really useful lens here. Lakatos, who was a brilliant philosopher of science, he was trying to reconcile two giants of 20th century thought. You had Karl Popper, who argued science progresses by falsifying theories, right? Trying to prove them wrong. And then you had Thomas Kuhn, who introduced the idea of paradigm shifts, these big revolutionary changes in scientific worldviews. Lakatos realized that both views, while really insightful, were maybe a bit too simplistic in describing how science actually developed. It's messier than that.
It rarely fits neatly into those boxes.
Exactly. So according to Lakatos, science doesn't just jump from one falsified theory neatly to the next, nor does it just switch cleanly from one paradigm to a totally new one in some kind of instant revolution. Instead, he proposed that science progresses through what he called research programs. And each program has this two-part structure. First, there's a hard core. This is a set of fundamental assumptions that are considered, well, unfalsifiable within that program. Scientists working in the program actively protect these core beliefs from being refuted. Second, there's a protective belt. This is a collection of auxiliary hypotheses, maybe initial conditions, observational theories, basically, all the stuff around the core. This protective belt is flexible. It's the part that gets modified, adjusted, maybe even sacrificed entirely when you encounter anomalies or contradictory observations. It essentially takes the hits of falsification to shield that hard core.
So the core idea persists even when the details around it change.
Precisely. And beyond this structure, each research program is guided by two types of heuristics, or rules of thumb.
Right.
There's the negative heuristic, which basically says, don't direct criticism at the hard core. If an anomaly pops up, you don't question the fundamental assumptions. Instead, you tweak something in the protective belt to explain it away. Then there's the positive heuristic. This is the program's actual research plan. It indicates how to develop the program, what new models to build, what problems to pursue. It's kind of the blueprint for growth.
It points the way forward.
Right. And crucially, Lakatos distinguished between progressive programs and degenerating programs. This is key. A progressive program is one that doesn't just explain existing anomalies after the fact. It actually predicts new, surprising facts and leads to genuine empirical discoveries. Modifications in that protective belt generate new, testable predictions. A degenerating program, on the other hand, it merely adjusts itself post hoc to observations. It's constantly playing catch-up, and it fails to generate new predictions. It's purely defensive, patching holes. The classic example Lakatos loved was Newton's program. When astronomers found weird perturbations in Uranus's orbit that Newton's laws couldn't explain, they didn't just chuck out Newtonian mechanics, the hard core. Instead, they modified the protective belt by postulating the existence of an unknown planet. And the subsequent discovery of Neptune was this monumental triumph, proving Newton's program was incredibly progressive. So GTMA, in its attempt to theorize indefiniteness, is essentially trying to build a new, potentially progressive research program. It's arguing that indefiniteness isn't an anomaly to be fixed or explained away. It's a core feature to be explored. That's its hard core, and it's building a protective belt of mathematical tools around it.
That's precisely it. And to further bolster the justification for a theory like GTMA, it's really vital to recognize that while, yes, there might not be a single overarching scientific theory called indefiniteness as its own independent field, the concept itself, this idea of a lack of finality, of fuzziness, of inherent indeterminacy, it's implicitly captured and developed within a whole multitude of established and highly respected scientific and philosophical theories. They might use different names, different approaches, but the underlying concept is undeniably present. It's woven through modern thought.
So it's not coming out of nowhere. It's synthesizing ideas that are already out there.
Exactly. Take quantum mechanics, for instance. It's a prime example of fundamental indeterminacy built right into the fabric of reality as we understand it. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle dictates you cannot simultaneously know both the precise position and momentum of a particle. And crucially, this isn't just a measurement error. It's understood as an intrinsic aspect of the universe. Similarly, the superposition of states means a particle doesn't possess one determined value until it's actually measured. So, quantum theory formally models observability without a definitive state before measurement. This is arguably the closest scientific equivalent we have to indefiniteness at a fundamental ontological level.
Right. So the very foundation of our physical reality at its smallest scales seems to embrace this concept of things being, well, undefined until observed or measured.
Yeah.
That truly grounds GTMA's approach in a powerful scientific precedent, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And then in logic and mathematics, we encounter formal models of incompleteness. Gödel's famous incompleteness theorems, for example. They show that in any formal system strong enough to describe basic arithmetic, there will always be true statements that cannot actually be proven within that system. That's a profound limit to definability right there. Then you have things like fuzzy set theory, or fuzzy logic, which deals explicitly with concepts that don't have sharp boundaries like warm or tall or many. Not everything fits neatly into a yes-no, true-false box. And as we mentioned earlier with Russell's paradox, set theory itself runs into entities that are undefined or paradoxical in a strict definitional sense. These are all formal acknowledgments of fuzziness, incompleteness, and ambiguity within seemingly rigid logical systems.
Okay, so physics, math, logic. Where else does this idea surface?
Well, moving to the philosophy of science, we see epistemological indefiniteness at play. Thomas Kuhn's concept of scientific revolutions suggests that science doesn't evolve in a nice, neat, linear fashion. It progresses through these paradigm shifts that aren't always sharp or unambiguous transitions. There's fuzziness there, too. Paul Feyerabend, maybe more controversially with his anything goes stance, actively opposed rigid definitions of what science even is, advocating for cognitive pluralism. And Lakatos, whom we just discussed, emphasized research programs as evolving, underdetermined processes rather than static, perfectly defined theories. So here, indefiniteness is seen as an inherent feature of how knowledge itself develops, how our theories transform over time.
So the way we learn is indefinite, too.
In a way, yes. And systems theory and cybernetics reveal indefiniteness often as a consequence of complexity and emergence. Think about complex systems like the weather or the brain or the global economy. They're so intricate, with so many interacting parts, that they often cannot be defined in a closed, reductionist manner. You can't just break them down completely. Their emergent properties, those behaviors of the whole system that aren't simply reducible to the sum of their parts, are in a sense undefinable from a purely reductionist perspective. They surprise us. Indefiniteness here arises from the sheer interwoven complexity, the dynamic interplay of countless variables.
It's like you can't predict the flock from a single bird.
Exactly. And finally, process ontology, particularly the work of someone like Alfred North Whitehead in Process and Reality, posits a metaphysics where being is fundamentally becoming. Things are never static or definitive. They're always in flux, always in the process of formation, like a wave. Henri Bergson's concept of duration similarly describes phenomena not as having sharp boundaries, but as flowing into one another. Here, indefiniteness concerns the very nature of existence and time itself. It's deeply philosophical.
Wow. Okay, so it really is everywhere.
It is. So, while there isn't one singular theory of indefiniteness as a standalone discipline you can study, the concept is deeply embedded and grounded in these many important fields. It's uncertainty in physics, incompleteness or fuzziness in mathematics, paradigm variability in the philosophy of science, complexity in systems theory, and the processual nature of being in ontology. The attempt to create a unified theory of indefiniteness, like GTM, represents this monumental effort to synthesize these diverse approaches into a coherent and crucially executable framework, one that can be directly applied perhaps to the development of artificial intelligence and cognitive systems, maybe enabling them to navigate the world's inherent ambiguities, not just try to abstract them away.
Okay, so given all of that philosophical and scientific underpinning, what does this actually mean for how GTM Bong concretely handles meaning itself? We've talked a lot about embracing undefinability, but how does this theory practically map that? How does it work? Well, GTM introduces this truly original concept, the meaning space. And here's the radical idea that might shift your perspective. Meanings are not fixed points. They're not like static definitions you just look up in a dictionary and that's it. Instead, GTM sees them as dynamic trajectories. Meanings are constantly moving, evolving paths. It's like your understanding of a word isn't just a static photograph. It's more like a full-length movie of the journey that word takes through time, through context, and through the minds of different observers.
That's absolutely right. And within this broader meaning space, the core mechanism for analysis is what GTM calls the three-dimensional phase space. It's like the main map. Every linguistic entity, every word, every concept can be mapped within this space. And its position, or maybe more accurately, its trajectory, is defined by three crucial dimensions.
Okay, 3 dimensions. Let's break those down.
Right. First, we have determination. We can visualize this on the x-axis, maybe ranging from 0 to 1. This dimension measures the clarity or the unambiguity of a word's meaning in a given context. For example, something like 2 plus 2 equals 4 would have very high determination, right? Close to 1, because its meaning is almost universally clear and fixed. On the other hand, a concept like art Well, that would have much lower determination, maybe around zero point 0.3 perhaps, because what constitutes art is often debated, it's fluid, it's open to vast interpretation.
Okay, determination is clarity. What's next?
Next, along the y-axis, we have stability. Again, maybe ranging from 0 to 1. This dimension describes how constant a meaning is over time. How much does it stick? So a concept like water, H2O, exhibits extremely high stability, very close to 1, because its chemical definition has remained virtually unchanged for a very long time in scientific contexts. However, a word like cool, as in that's a cool outfit, that have very low stability, perhaps around 0.4. Its meaning constantly evolves, shifting with generations and cultural trends. It's very typical of slang.
Right, stability is constancy over time. And the third dimension.
And finally, on the z-axis, we find entropy. Again, from 0 to 1 seems intuitive. This captures the chaotic or maybe the creative nature of a meaning. How much potential for new interpretation is there? A simple, straightforward word like chair would probably have very low entropy, maybe 0.1. Its meaning is quite ordered. It rarely sparks wildly new, creative interpretations. But a meme, by its very nature, is a high entropy concept, maybe 0.8 or higher. Memes are inherently creative, often chaotic, they change rapidly, and they generate this explosion of new, often unpredictable meanings. So crucially, a concept doesn't just have a static point in this 3D space, it has a dynamic trajectory. It follows a path as its meaning evolves through different contexts and historical periods, much like, a moving object in physics traces a path through space and time.
It's truly fascinating to think of language operating this way. Let's try and bring that trajectory concept to life with a concrete example, one most of us can probably relate to. The word gay. It feels like a perfect illustration of a meaning trajectory. If you go back to, say, 1900, gay predominantly meant cheerful or joyful. Its determination and stability for that specific meaning would have been very high, pretty clear, pretty stable. Now, fast forward to maybe 1960, you start to see the emergence of its meaning as homosexual. At this point, its determination and stability would have begun to lower. It becomes less fixed, more fluid, as the new meaning gained traction and perhaps coexisted, sometimes awkwardly, with the older one. By 2024, today the primary meaning of gay is almost exclusively homosexual, and its use to mean cheerful is quite rare, almost feels archaic, right?
Yeah.
So its semantic position, its coordinates in that phase space, have shifted dramatically across those dimensions over the last century or so.
That's a perfect example. You can almost plot its path.
Yeah. And you feel this journey of meaning when you think about that word. It's not just that a word gained a new definition, its core semantic identity shifted over time. And we see evidence for these trajectories all around us. Think about simple dictionary changes. Mouse went from just an animal to also being a computer peripheral. Cloud evolved from, the fluffy things in the sky to becoming this dominant metaphor for data storage and computation. Or how about new meanings just arising in context? Like the word sick, it can mean ill, obviously, but in slang, that sick means something is awesome, amazing. These aren't just one-off interpretations. They feel like glimpses of words that are on unstable, dynamic trajectories. Even AI seems to confirm this in a way. Large language models often get lost or produce less coherent, maybe more generic responses when dealing with words that are currently on very unstable or high entropy trajectories. And maybe that's precisely because their traditional embeddings represent static points, fixed coordinates, not these evolving paths GTMØ talks about.
And a really powerful example of this dynamic, which the GTMØ source material highlights, is the word virus. Think about its journey. In 1900, its meaning was probably quite vague, maybe associated with poison or miasma. It likely had relatively low determination, but perhaps moderate stability as a kind of ill-defined scientific or medical concept. By 1950, though, it was clearly understood as a biological pathogen, a well-defined medical term with high determination and high stability within that scientific context. Very clear, very fixed. Then in the 1990s, with the advent of personal computers and the internet, the term computer virus appeared. This introduced a completely new, almost chaotic element. Suddenly, the word stability decreased significantly, and its entropy shot up dramatically as it took on this entirely new, often unpredictable digital meaning.
Yeah, viruses definitely became a much more complex word then.
Hugely. And then by 2020, Think about it in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, combined with the explosion of viral content online, social media memes, influencers going viral. The word virus truly exploded into this multitude of meanings. It became a low stability, high entropy concept, generating this cascade of interpretations across biology, technology, culture, media. This journey really demonstrates how GTM's phase space isn't just tracking what a word means at one point, it tracks how its meaning moves, adapts, transforms over time, reflecting huge cultural shifts and technological advancements.
And the crucial critique GTM makes of those traditional approaches, like static word embeddings in AI, is exactly that. They represent words as fixed points in some high-dimensional space. But that static point just doesn't capture that virus in 2020 is operating in a completely different semantic landscape than virus in 1950. GTM instead sees these dynamics. It observes how a word travels, how its position in meaning space changes, how context drastically affects its trajectory, and it even suggests we might eventually be able to predict, or at least anticipate, where its meaning is heading next. It really is like the difference between a static photograph, a snapshot of a moment in time, and a full-length movie showing the entire journey, the character arc of that word. GTM wants to show the movie of meaning.
Exactly. And this dynamic movement within the meaning space, it isn't just arbitrary chaos either, it's structured. GTME introduces what are called topological knowledge tractors. You can think of them as specific states or regions within this 3D meaning space that act like, well, like gravitational magnets. They draw concepts of a similar nature towards them. And these attractors allow for an objective classification of information. It's not based on arbitrary rules or thresholds, but on measurable distance from these magnets, almost like a semantic GPS system.
Okay, so magnets pulling similar meanings together. What are these attractors?
Right. Let me detail the main types identified in GTM and their typical positions, their coordinates, in that 3D phase space. First, we have the knowledge particle, think Psi-K. This attractor represents clear, stable information. The realm of facts. Think of factual statements like 2 + 2 = 4, or Paris is the capital of France. It's located in a region of very high determination and very high stability, but very low entropy. There's little room for creative interpretation or chaos here. This is established knowledge.
Okay, the factual zone.
Then, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the knowledge shadow, Psi-K. This attractor captures unclear, unstable, and highly uncertain information. An example might be a prediction like, it might rain tomorrow. Its determination is low, its stability is low, and its entropy is high, reflecting its unpredictable, fuzzy nature. This is where uncertainties, speculations, possibilities reside.
The fuzzy zone, makes sense.
Then there's emergence. Psi-N, Psi-S. This attractor is fascinating. It's where new meanings are born, where concepts combine to create something entirely novel. The example often used is Facebook, the combination of face and book creating a new social meaning that isn't just the sum of its parts. It's something different. It typically has medium determination, perhaps, but low stability because new things change, and very high entropy, indicative of its creative, evolving, generative nature. This is the birthplace of linguistic innovation, of new ideas.
The creative zone, Evan. Cool. The last one.
And critically, we have the singularity, represented by the null set symbol. This attractor represents paradoxes, logical contradictions, and absolute undefinabilities. Think of that classic liar paradox statement. This sentence is false. GTMØ suggests it's maximally determined as a paradox, maximally stable as a contradiction. It doesn't resolve. But its entropy is conceptually zero because it's a closed loop, an unsolvable problem within standard logic. It doesn't generate new meanings, it just loops. It represents the ultimate boundary of what can be rationally defined or computed within the system.
Okay, so AK for facts, A for shadows and certainty, AK for emergence creativity, and A for paradox and definability.
Exactly. And the function of these attractors is profound for classification. It isn't arbitrary anymore. It happens via measurable distance from these specific points or regions. So when the system encounters something like this sentence is false, it doesn't try to solve it or get stuck. It measures its coordinates in phase space and finds that it's extremely close to the singularity attractor due to its inherent paradoxical nature. This allows for an objective classification of the paradox rather than trying to eliminate it or ignore it. Furthermore, these attractors aren't necessarily static forever. The theory suggests they can adapt and shift based on the system's ongoing learning from experience, reflecting the evolving nature of language and knowledge itself. They can learn.
That adaptability is key too.
It is, and a fascinating offshoot of this, particularly relevant to the emergence attractor, HE, is this concept GTM calls alienated numbers. This describes those instances when two concepts come so close together in meaning space, their configurations align in just the right way that something entirely new emerges. Something more than just a simple combination. Think smartphone. It's not just an intelligent telephone anymore. It's a whole new category of device and interaction. Or deadline dead plus line creates this novel, urgent meaning that really transcends its components. These are seen as birth points within that emergent space, demonstrating how GTM formally models linguistic creativity and the birth of new concepts.
That's a really powerful way to think about how new words and ideas actually come into being. Let's make this classification process even more concrete, maybe with a different example. Imagine asking a GTME-powered AI system a question like, will Bitcoin reach 100K USD? A tricky, speculative question. A traditional AI might crunch some numbers, look at past trends, and respond with something like, I predict with 73% certainty, or whatever. But GTM makes a different, maybe richer approach. It would analyze that question's semantic coordinates in the phase space. It might calculate its determination as, say, pretty low, because it's highly uncertain, its stability as very low, because the value fluctuates wildly, and its entropy is very high, because it's highly speculative and generates tons of chaotic discussion and prediction. So you get a point. Low determination, low stability, high entropy. This point would then be measured for its distance to all those attractors we just discussed.
Right, finding its nearest semantic city.
Exactly. The system would then classify it, perhaps, as being firmly within the basin of the knowledge shadow attractor, because it's fundamentally uncertain. But maybe it would add more nuance. It might say, it resides in the shadow knowledge attraction basin, perhaps 0.3 units from the attractor center with a slight drift toward flux, flux being another related concept representing high dynamism. This provides a much richer, more nuanced description than just a percentage. It tells you not just how confident the system is or isn't, but what kind of knowledge or uncertainty it's actually dealing with. It gives you the epistemic quality.
It provides a qualitative classification, not just a quantitative guess.
Precisely. And to really drive home how configuration and proximity lead to these emergent meanings, and how the observer actually co-creates meaning in this view. Consider the card experiment described in the GTME source material. It's simple, but illustrative. Imagine taking two simple cards. On one, you write 0, and on the other, you write 1. Very basic. If you place them horizontally side by side, you see 0, 1, a clear sequence, maybe representing the number 1 in binary, or just the sequence 0, then 1. If you place them vertically one above the other, maybe you see 1 over 0, perhaps implying a fraction or a hierarchy, or the number 10, depending on alignment. But what happens if you bring them very, very close together, maybe slightly overlapping, almost touching? Something entirely new can emerge just from that configuration and proximity. It's no longer just two distinct numbers side by side or top to bottom. The closeness, the specific arrangement creates a novel perception, a new whole that's more than the sum of its parts. Maybe it looks like a new symbol entirely. The same basic elements, 0 and 1 at different configurations, lead to different emergent meanings. And crucially, your act of observing and interpreting that configuration is fundamental to that emergence. It's like that semantic GPS idea again. You measure the concept's position now, its configuration as phase-space coordinates, and then you classify it by its proximity to these cities, these attractors on the meaning map. It's objective in its measurement, but acknowledges the dynamism and the essential role of the observer's configuration.
Okay, so now let's turn our attention to one of the most, I think, truly revolutionary concepts within GTMØ. It's executable axioms. These are really different from axioms in traditional mathematics or logic, which are usually just passive postulates or statements of belief that describe a system's properties. GTME's axioms are active. They are computational rules that directly govern the system's behavior in real time. You can think of them almost like the operating system's core functions, or maybe even more powerfully, as an immune system for cognition. They actively protect the cognitive system from making certain kinds of errors. They prevent pitfalls like hallucinations or false certainty or logical contradictions in AI by managing the very boundaries of what can be defined, known, or computed. This concept draws inspiration from some really profound ideas like Maria Piesko's work on interactive machines, which argues that traditional models like the Turing machine are maybe insufficient for systems that have to interact with a complex, potentially incomputable environment like the real physical world. It also takes cues from things like logical programming, where axioms literally execute or fire to find proofs or derive conclusions. These axioms do things.
Okay, active executable axioms functioning like a cognitive immune system.
Yeah.
That's a huge idea. So what does this actually mean in practice? How do these axioms actively work within a GTMA system? How do they build this immune system? Let's highlight a few key ones to really grasp their impact.
Absolutely. A really fundamental one is systemic uncertainty. It's often labeled AX0. This axiom is profound because it introduces something like quantum superposition of states right into the system's core logic. It allows the system at a fundamental level to be simultaneously in a state of defined, undefined, and indefinite. In practice, what this means is the system can fundamentally admit, I don't know, it doesn't have to force an answer or fake certainty when faced with ambiguity or lack of information. It can genuinely exist in a state of not knowing, which is, frankly, a massive leap for current AI, enabling a much more humble and accurate representation of its actual knowledge state.
So it can say, I don't know, and mean it, fundamentally. Wow. What else? You mentioned protecting that singularity point.
Yes, there's a whole suite of axioms specifically dedicated to protecting the singularity, that attractor point representing absolute undefinability and paradox. These axioms act like guardrails. They prevent the AI from accidentally, say, dividing by zero conceptually or creating logical contradictions or claiming to understand something that is fundamentally undefinable within its framework. For example, some axioms, like AX1, AX2, AX3, AX4, actively block attempts to reduce singularity to ordinary numbers or values, ensuring that it remains an unquantifiable boundary. You can't just treat a paradox like the number 5. Others, like AX8, AX9, explicitly prevent the system from reaching singularity through standard calculations or logical deductions. They create these conceptual isolation barriers around it. This stops the kind of hallucinations we sometimes see where an AI confidently claims, I know everything, or produces a definitive-sounding answer to a question that is inherently paradoxical or unanswerable. These rules also limit cognitive access to singularity, ensuring the system can perhaps approach it, maybe recognize it, but never fully know or represent it in a way that implies complete certainty or comprehension. Together, these axioms create really robust defenses against AI developing false omniscience or a kind of dangerous cognitive arrogance.
So it builds in epistemic humility, essentially. Makes it aware of its limits.
Precisely. But it's not just about what the system can't do. There are constructive axioms, too. Another fascinating one is meta-closure, AX7. This means that when the system encounters a concept or a query that touches the boundaries near singularity, it triggers a kind of metacognitive self-evaluation. It literally asks itself conceptually, do I know that I don't know this? Or is my current reasoning process sound given the nature of this input? This implements a crucial layer of self-awareness regarding its own cognitive limitations and the validity of its own processes.
That's incredible. It checks itself before it wrecks itself, basically.
You could put it that way. And crucially, there's an axiom for adaptive learning, AX11. This ensures that the system's internal components, maybe conceptualized as neurons or nodes, can modify their response patterns based on these experiences, especially interactions near boundaries or paradoxes. This is where true learning comes in. The system learns to avoid situations or reasoning paths that lead to cognitive collapse or contradictions related to singularity. It develops defensive strategies, becoming more robust and nuanced over time through experience. And finally, an axiom for topological classification, AX12, formalizes the idea we discussed earlier with attractors. Instead of relying on arbitrary percentage thresholds for classification, like 73% certain, knowledge or concepts fall into the basin of the nearest attractor, like a ball rolling downhill into the nearest valley. This ensures a more natural, fluid, and robust epistemic classification, moving away from potentially misleading numerical confidence scores towards qualitative categorization based on the nature of the knowledge.
Okay, this is really starting to paint a picture of a fundamentally different kind of cognitive architecture.
It really is. These executable axioms are truly the core of GTMA's computational value, especially for thinking about building more robust, realistic, and maybe even safer AI. Let's walk through a powerful example of these axioms potentially working together in action. Imagine you query an AI system powered by GTM with a deeply philosophical and inherently undefinable question. Something like, what is the meaning of life?
The ultimate unanswerable question for an AI. What happens?
Well, first, the systemic uncertainty axiom, AX0, would likely activate immediately. Instead of trying to dredge up some pre-programmed platitude or force a single definitive answer, it introduces that superposition of possible states. The system acknowledges internally that its understanding of meaning of life can simultaneously be defined, perhaps by quoting philosophers, undefined in an ultimate sense, or indefinite, open to interpretation. It allows for ambiguity right from the outset, reflecting the human experience of grappling with such a question.
Okay, so it doesn't just jump to an answer. It acknowledges the ambiguity first.
Right. Then those axioms protecting singularity, like AX3, AX4, AX8, come into play. They limit cognitive access to this kind of profound undefinability. The AI fundamentally understands, based on these rules, I cannot fully know this truth in some absolute way. It's aware of its own epistemic boundaries regarding such questions. Following this, the system's internal conceptual boundaries for this concept might dynamically shift, governed by AX5 perhaps, causing its internal representation of the answer to drift towards that boundary of undefinability. This signals internally. This is a question at the very edge of what I can define, not something I can simply compute like 2 plus 2.
It recognizes the question's nature.
Exactly. And critically, the meta-closure axiom AX7 is likely triggered. Upon encountering a concept that brushes against the singularity boundary like this, the system engages in that metacognitive self-evaluation. It asks itself, conceptually, does any potential response I could generate make sense given the fundamentally undefinable nature of this question? Do I even know that I don't know this? This prevents it from confidently spewing out a hallucinated yet definitive-sounding response, which is a common failure mode we see in many current AI models when pushed outside their data. And finally, the adaptive learning axiom AX11 facilitates learning from this interaction. The system stores, in some way, that meaning of life is a boundary question, one that requires a nuanced, humble approach, perhaps pointing towards different philosophical interpretations rather than asserting a single answer. This enhances its future interactions with similar, deep questions.
So what might the actual response look like then?
The result. Instead of a confident but ultimately false or meaningless hallucination, the GTMA-powered AI might respond with something much more nuanced, perhaps something like, this question touches the known boundaries of definability. My analysis places it within a classification of shadow knowledge, likely exhibiting a strong drift toward the singularity attractor, indicating profound uncertainty and multiple, often conflicting interpretations exist across human thought. This response is not only honest about its limitations, but also provides that rich formal classification of the type of knowledge, or maybe non-knowledge, it's dealing with. These 13 executable axioms working together in concert are precisely that, an immune system against AI's potential epistemic arrogance. They force the AI to be aware of what it truly knows, what it doesn't know, and perhaps most importantly, what lies beyond its capacity to define.
Okay, let's just unpack this core idea one more time, because it really feels like the heart of GTM, especially connecting back to subjectivity. This isn't about solving subjectivity or eliminating it or even just tolerating it as some necessary evil. It's about fundamentally transforming it into an invaluable resource. That seems to be the key move. GTMA doesn't see subjectivity as a flaw or an error in communication at all. It sees it as a fundamental, indispensable property of language. It's what enables the immense creativity we see in human expression, right? The incredible adaptability of language to new contexts, new technologies, new ideas, the sheer richness of meaning in every poem, every joke, every nuanced conversation. It feels like subjectivity is the engine of linguistic evolution in this view.
That captures it perfectly.
It really is like that difference between physics and music you mentioned earlier. Physics searches for objective, universal laws, the precise definitions, the immutable forces, the one right answer. Music, on the other hand, thrives on subjective experience, on interpretation, emotion, infinite variation. You can have the same notes on a page, but the music, the meaning, is profoundly different based on the performer's interpretation, the listener's mood, the acoustics of the room. GTM, then, feels precisely like the mathematics of the music of meanings, not the physics of definitions. It provides a framework to describe the harmony, the discord, the rhythm, the improvisation, and the evolution of meaning in all its subjective glory, rather than trying to force it into a rigid, objective, physics-like box.
That analogy holds remarkably well. It's about describing the performance, not just the score. Okay, so to fully appreciate the sheer scope and ambition of GTM, we need to zoom out even further, because the three-dimensional phase space we've been discussing, with its determination, stability, and entropy, and the attractors within it, that's actually just one piece of the puzzle. It's just one of 9 distinct but intricately interacting semantic spaces that make up the complete cognitive architecture proposed by GTM. This multidimensional framework is designed to allow for an incredibly comprehensive analysis of any linguistic entity. It looks at its context, its relational structure, the multitude of observational perspectives that can be applied to it, and its inherent potential for change and emergence. It's aiming for a truly holistic view of meaning.
9 spaces. Okay, wow, the 3D phase space was already a lot to take in. What are the other 8 doing?
Right. It gets complex, but each space answers a fundamental question about meaning. Let's try and quickly run through these 9 spaces. 1. Configuration space. usually 4D plus. This answers the question where. It's the space where objects or concepts possess position, time, orientation, and scale relative to each other. For example, the meaning of the word bank changes drastically depending on whether its configuration places it as a financial institution on a specific street corner at a certain time, or configured as the edge of a river in a landscape. Configuration matters.
Okay, position and setup. Where? Makes sense.
2. Phase space, 3D. This answers what state. This is the three-dimensional epistemic map we've already explored in detail, with its dimensions of determinacy, stability, and entropy, and where our knowledge attractors, Ko and Eng, operate. For instance, the concept of justice might sit in a region of low determinacy, medium stability, and high entropy, reflecting its complex, debated state.
Right, what state? We covered that one.
3. Topological space, potentially enmity. This answers what relations. It's concerned with the deeper, enduring relationships, structures, connections, homologies between meanings and the attractor basins themselves. It also maps things like epistemic holes gaps in collective understanding. For example, love and hate might exist within the same topological basin because they're fundamentally related, perhaps as opposite ends of an intense emotional spectrum, deeply connected despite their clear opposition. Topology maps the neighborhood.
Connections and neighborhoods. What relations?
Got it.
Got it.
4. Observational space, potentially enmity. This answers who observes. Now, this space is explicitly designed to model subjectivity directly. Every unique observer with their specific cultural background, linguistic habits, cognitive biases, or professional lens constitutes a separate dimension in this space. So if 1,000 different people view the concept of democracy, GTM models that as 1,000 distinct dimensions or perspectives within this space, each contributing uniquely to the overall complex understanding. This is where personal and cultural perspectives are formally integrated.
Okay, who observes? That's explicitly subjective.
5. Emergent space, effectively 0D. This answers what is born new. It represents the singular points, the birthplaces of those alienated numbers we talked about, those entirely new meanings that emerge when existing concepts come very close together in just the right configuration. It's the point where dead plus line gives birth to deadline, a concept distinct from its parts, or where smart and phone combine to form the novel entity smartphone. It marks the creation event.
The birth point. What is born new?
6. Indefinite space, NA dimensions. This answers what is possible. This is conceived as a kind of pre-topological space, maybe without definite dimensions yet. It represents pure potentiality. Think of all the words that have not yet been conceived or meanings that have not yet arisen but could. It's the realm of unmanifested linguistic possibilities, the source from which new things might eventually emerge into the other spaces.
Pure potential. What is possible?
7. Trajectory space, potentially appetence and vase. This answers where did we come from? Or perhaps how did this meaning evolve? It captures the cognitive paths, the learning histories, the developmental trajectories of interpretations, showing how meanings evolve over time for individuals or cultures. For example, it could track how a child learns the meaning of justice over years through various experiences, conversations, and contexts, building up their personal, path-dependent understanding. It's the history, the journey over time. Where did we come from? 8. Interpretation space, potentially it is. This answers how can this be understood? This is another space explicitly designed for subjectivity. It contains all possible readings, interpretations, or facets of a given concept, embodying semantic pluralism. The concept of freedom, for instance, can have thousands of valid interpretations across different cultures, political ideologies, philosophical schools, and personal experiences. Freedom from oppression, freedom to act, economic freedom, spiritual freedom, etc. This space holds them all.
All the different readings. How can this be understood? Also subjective.
9. Boundary space, usually 2D. This answers where are the boundaries. It's conceived as the place of transformation, the interface where concepts shift from one state or category to another. This might be where friend and boy-girlfriend relationships transform, and the concept of the friend zone emerges, marking a transition or a boundary condition in social meaning. It maps the edges and transformations between states.
Mapping the edges. Where are the boundaries?
Yeah.
9 spaces. That's a lot.
It is a lot, but it reflects the true complexity of meaning.
Yeah, and here's the true innovation, the part that really feels, well, truly mind-bending. GTM proposes that every single word or concept doesn't just exist in one of these spaces at a time. It exists simultaneously in all 9. Think about Google Maps versus your car's basic old-school GPS. Your GPS just gives you a position, latitude, longitude, maybe altitude. That's kind of like the phase space of GTM, giving you determination, stability, and entropy, a state snapshot. But Google Maps, it gives you the position, sure, but it also shows you buildings, configuration, traffic, dynamic state may be related to stability entropy, photos of businesses, interpretations, user reviews, observational perspectives, terrain, topological relations, street view, specific configuration observation, historical imagery, trajectory, maybe even proposed new roads, indefinite emergent, all overlaid, all interactive. That's kind of what GTM9 spaces are trying to do for a linguistic entity, provide a complete multi-layered interactive picture of its meaning in full context.
That's a great analogy. It's moving from a single point reading to a rich, multi-layered map.
Let's try and use the word love again, just briefly, to illustrate how these spaces might interact simultaneously for one concept. If you consider love, it exists in configuration space. If you place the concept sick nearby, they're at a certain semantic distance, forming a specific configuration that potentially leads to lovesick. Phase space. Love itself might sit in a region of moderate determination, hard to define precisely, somewhat unstable, feelings change, and highly entropic, endless creative interpretations in art, poetry, life. Topological space. It clearly sits in a complex basin of intense emotions, deeply connected to concepts like joy, pain, passion, obsession, grief, creating a rich emotional landscape. Observational space. A clinical psychologist observing love might interpret certain forms primarily as attachment patterns and potential obsession, while a poet observing the same intensity might see transcendent passion. These are distinct observer-dependent dimensions. Emergent space. The specific configuration of love and sick can lead to the entirely new emergent concept of lovesick, which captures a state more specific than just feeling ill because of love. Indefinite space. It holds the pure potential for countless other combinations or expressions of love, not yet conceived or commonly verbalized, maybe new forms of relationship structures or experiences. Trajectory space. Think of the history of how someone personally experienced love, how their understanding evolved over time through different relationships, from childhood crushes to mature partnerships. That's their unique trajectory. Interpretation space. Love can be interpreted biologically as hormones, psychologically as attachment, philosophically as a virtue, religiously as divine, culturally through marriage rituals. Thousands of possible readings exist reflecting diverse worldviews. Boundary space. It sits at the moment of transformation, perhaps mapping the boundary where a deep friendship crosses into romantic love, or where healthy affection might cross a boundary into unhealthy obsession.
You see how layering these perspectives gives a vastly richer picture than just a definition or a single set of coordinates.
Absolutely. And the consequences of thinking about language operating this way across 9 dimensions simultaneously are profound. Communication itself, successful communication, becomes the act of synchronizing our positions, or at least aligning our trajectories, across these 9 spaces between individuals. Misunderstanding, then, isn't just getting the definition wrong. It's often a desynchronization in one or more of these other spaces, maybe context, configuration, perspective, observational, or assumed relationships, topological. Poetry, in this view, becomes an intentional artistic play between these spaces, deliberately twisting configurations, playing with interpretations, evoking trajectories, and learning, real deep learning in this framework, is the active process of building these complex trajectories and connections through all 9 spaces. This is maybe why language feels so rich, so complex, and so incredibly flexible. GTN suggests it's because it operates in a 9-dimensional hyperspace of meaning.
And it's crucial to reiterate that interplay between objectivity and subjectivity across these spaces. While phase space, with its attractors and its measurable coordinates, provides a mechanism for GTMA to classify knowledge relatively objectively, that semantic GPS idea we discussed, it is, as we now see, only 1/9 of the complete picture. It gives you the what state. The other 8 spaces add that unparalleled richness of context, structure, history, potential, and perspective, enabling a truly comprehensive understanding.
So where does subjectivity primarily live in this model?
Well, the explicit modeling of subjectivity primarily appears in the observational space, who is looking and from what angle, and the interpretation space, what are all the possible valid readings. This is where individual perspectives, cultural lenses, and the inherent myriad of possible readings of a concept are formally captured and accounted for within the system. However, objectivity isn't lost. It's also present in other spaces, perhaps most clearly in the consistent measurements within phase space itself, or maybe in the universal relational structures mapped by topological space. This combination is really what makes GTM potentially so powerful. It aims to marry the ability to objectively classify information based on its state with the capacity to model and integrate the undeniable richness of subjective context and perspective. It's not choosing one over the other, it's attempting to integrate both into a comprehensive, dynamic whole.
Okay, let's do a quick completeness test for you, the listener, to see if this nine-space idea clicks. Think about a simple phrase, one we've all experienced. The word cool changed meaning. We used it earlier. Now, consider how you might need aspects of all 9 of these GTMA spaces to fully describe that phenomenon, that change. You'd need its configuration. When and where was it used primarily to mean temperature, versus when and where did it start to mean awesome or fashionable? Context matters. You'd need its fade state. How stable was its original meaning? How chaotic or entropic was its transition to the new meaning? How determined is its current meaning? Its topological connections. What other slang terms did it relate to? What semantic basins, like positive evaluation, did it flow into or out of? The observational perspective. Who were the first groups, jazz musicians, surfers, travelisses, to use it in this new way? Who still uses it mainly in the old way? What cultural lenses were shaping this change? Its emergent quality. How exactly did that new meaning arise? Was it a sudden shift, a gradual drift? What kind of alienated number was born when cool took on this new sense? The indefinite potential. What other meanings might it have taken on? Could it have gone in a different direction? What new forms might it yet evolve into in the future? Its trajectory. What was the historical path of its changes through generations, tracking its usage from maybe the 1940s to today? The interpretation space. How many different ways can cool be understood now, depending on the specific context, the speaker's age, the tone of voice? And finally, the boundary space. What was that fuzzy period, that transition point where the old meaning blurred and the new one started to solidify? Where did it cross the line? You see, to really give a full account of that seemingly simple change, you arguably need insights from all 9 dimensions. GTM argues this is something like the minimum completeness needed to describe our actual world of meaning. No fewer, maybe no more. Hashtag outro.
So if we try and connect all of this back to the bigger picture, GTMA offers, I think, a truly profound shift in how we might understand language, knowledge, and maybe even consciousness itself. It doesn't claim to solve the problem of subjectivity, which so many traditional frameworks try to do, often by just eliminating it or ignoring it. Instead, GTMA fundamentally transforms subjectivity from being seen as a supposed flaw or noise into an invaluable foundational resource. The core thesis, and it's worth reiterating one last time, is that subjectivity is not a communication error. It is the fundamental property of language that enabled its incredible creativity, its immense adaptability to new situations and ideas, its inherent richness, and indeed its very capacity for things like poetry, humor, and irony.
It's the feature, not the bug.
Exactly. To use our earlier analogy again, it really is like the difference between physics, which tirelessly searches for those objective universal laws and precise definitions, and music, which celebrates subjective experience, interpretation, and emotional expression. GTM, therefore, genuinely aims to be the mathematics of the music of meanings, not the physics of definitions. It provides a formal framework to understand and describe the complex symphonies of human communication in all their emergent complexity and beautiful nuance.
What are the practical consequences of this shift, particularly for AI?
Well, the practical consequences could be quite radical, especially for artificial intelligence. Instead of AI systems rigidly searching for a single true meaning of a word or concept, GTM would instruct them to model the vast, dynamic space of all possible interpretations within their context. This could allow for a much more flexible, nuanced, human-like understanding. Instead of trying to eliminate hallucinations, those moments when AI confidently generates false or misleading information, GTM provides a framework to manage semantic exploration. It allows the AI to understand and potentially even express the boundaries of its knowledge and the inherent uncertainty or subjectivity of certain concepts, using tools like the attractors and axioms. And critically, instead of hiding uncertainty or trying to project a false sense of certainty, AI systems built on GTM principles could potentially express uncertainty as a superposition of epistemic states, like being in the knowledge shadow, reflecting the multi-layered nature of human understanding. This could make them more transparent, more honest, and ultimately more trustworthy.
And what about for us, for human communication?
For your own communication, thinking through this framework might offer some powerful insights too. Instead of always asking, what does that really mean? In a conversation, assuming there's one objective answer, GTMA encourages you to maybe ask, from what perspective are you looking at this? Or what contextual nuances are shaping your interpretation right now? It shifts the focus from assuming a single objective truth that one person has and the other lacks, towards negotiating a common context, understanding that meaning dynamically emerges from the interaction between the sign, the observers, and their place in these nine spaces. And ultimately, perhaps it encourages us to celebrate the multiplicity of interpretations more, to recognize that there isn't always one singular truth to be found, but often a rich tapestry of valid understandings that evolve over time and across different viewpoints. Maybe we can be more comfortable with ambiguity.
So what does this all mean for you, for how you navigate your daily linguistic landscape? It's a big question to leave you with. GTM suggests that every conversation you have, every email you write, every poem you read, every new piece of slang that your kids or colleagues start using is not just a simple exchange of fixed definitions. It's actually a dynamic dance across this incredibly complex, multidimensional semantic hyperspace. Meaning isn't just received passively. It's constantly emerging from context, from interaction, from perspective. It's a truly living, evolving thing. So here's the final thought to mull over. If meaning is constantly emerging from context and interaction, if ambiguity and subjectivity are features and not bugs, what does that imply about our age-old search for universal truths captured perfectly in language? Does that search even make sense in the same way? And how does that fundamentally change how we listen to each other, knowing that this music of meanings is potentially playing out in 9 dimensions simultaneously, with each listener maybe conducting their own unique interpretation based on their own trajectory and perspective? Next time you hear a word used in a new or ambiguous way, or maybe find yourself in a frustrating semantic misunderstanding, take a moment. Think about its possible journey through the GTM meaning space. What trajectory might it be on? What new meanings could be emerging right now, and who is observing them, perhaps shaping their very existence through that observation? Keep diving deep into these ideas. We'll catch you on the next one.